John is going to talk to us about What's Becoming of Waring, the last of AP's pre-war novels. John is Professor Emeritus of English Literature at University of York, where his main research interests are Shakespeare and Italian Renaissance literature. He says he's been reading and rereading Dance or Powell, particularly ever since he was introduced to dance by his Latin master at school. So, John, you presumably therefore came in, I was going to say early to the series, probably in the middle of the series at a guess. John is also one of the Society's trustees and has been a member for many, many, many years. So, John, over to you to talk to us about What's Become of Waring. And right. Okay, John, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Keith, and thank you, everybody. Welcome to the talk. Very nice of you to turn up. It is a lovely day here in York, but I've darkened the room for the talk. Well, AP or Powell published Waring with its allusion to Browning's poem, which is actually the title of Browning is Waring, in early 1939, when the shades of war were, of course, closing in. And it was to have its own, ironically, incendiary fate after publication. Exactly 999 copies were sold, but the rest of the stock perished when it went up. The publisher's warehouse went up in flames during the Blitz. Things that, well, that's a sort of twist of fate that somehow reflects the varieties of the novel. Because things that seem to have realized themselves suddenly are no more, they dissolve. I'll remind you of the plot. The novel, like all the pre-war novels of Powell, is strong on ironic humor. It's about this elusive figure, T.T. Waring, an author of travel books, a man who's never seen, he never appears in the publisher's offices, but he makes a lot of money for the firm of Judkins and Judkins, that is, two brothers. And the narrator of the novel himself, who is never named, he works for them. And the narrator, incidentally, is writing a study called Storndale and Some Thoughts on Violence. Nothing further seems to come of this, but the word violence dangles tantalizingly. Suddenly, out of the blue, comes news that Waring has perished abroad somewhere, and this throws the company into disarray. However, one thought is that at least they can get a biography out of this man because he's proved to be so popular. And it's the narrator's task to find a suitable biographer. There are a number of contenders, but the narrator proposes a man called Tiger Hudson, a captain in the Territorials, whom he meets by chance at a seance. There's the word seance, of course, one is used to that word in dance. The narrator has been invited there by one of the publishing brothers, Hugh Judkins, and he meets Hudson there. Hudson is engaged to a young woman called Beryl Pimley, who belongs to a respectable middle-class suburban family, verging a little on the dull side. But Hudson falls for another woman called Roberta Payne, who is a beguiling adventuress. Roberta leads several men a merry dance on the amorous carousel. As for Beryl, she's a good-looking girl, perhaps unexciting, but destined to make a good wife. She has a less attractive sister, Winifred, whose teeth are an unfortunate feature and whose manner is awkward to say the least. But wait a little. Winifred is to spring a surprise of her own. All comes to a head when Waring is discovered still alive in the south of France. He turns out to be Alec Pimley, Beryl's and Winifred's black sheep brother, a kind of remittance man, certainly not a man of integrity. In fact, it becomes clear to Tiger Hudson, the appointed biographer of Waring, that the man who he thought was Waring turns out to be Pimley, that Alec Pimley is masquerading, and that the books have all been plagiarized from works written a long time ago. The first of these all sounds a bit incestuous within the family, was written by Alec's senile grandfather, Captain Pimley, who, on encountering the narrator, imagines that he is Alec for a moment. So interesting how the narrator flits in and out of identities himself. Not too long after this, the yacht, which is owned by Alec Pimley's recent bride, an American lady of late middle age and enormous wealth, known only as Mrs. Campbell, and whom the narrator meets at that first seance. This yacht goes down in a storm on its way to Greece, and the couple go to a watery grave. The news is communicated by another character, Eustace Bromwich, who phones the narrator in the early hours telling him about it, and also that he, Eustace, is married to Roberta Payne, that is the glamorous adventuress. Bromwich appears on the first page of the novel at a wedding, and on the very last announcing his own wedding. The book's dramatic climax is not really the discovery of Waring, which is rather a pale affair, but the real identity of Waring, that is, but it's one involving various characters, including the Pimley sisters, Hudson and Hugh Judkins. And this takes place at a second seance right at the end. So there's quite a symmetrical patterning in this novel. It's very characteristic, it's very tightly and effortlessly plotted. Well, I want to leave the plot and action for a moment and ask a couple of questions about the surrounding details, the circumstances in which it was written, and of course, the time of writing, 1938. An interesting question, of course, also is the role of the narrator. This is the first time, as everybody knows, is the first time that Powell chooses to tell the story through a first-person narrator. So why the switch from third? How far does the enjoyable but rather slight theme engage with the situation abroad in the late 30s? Is it merely a mystery entertainment? This is, after all, the golden age of the detective mystery, along with people like Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers, Marjorie Allingham were all writing then. Was Powell doing a bit of subdued laughter at the expense of the detective story? Well, he says no himself. The kind of humor that Powell engages in the book is enigmatic, and it is far from straightforward. It can move from the funny to the disconcertingly off-key in a single sentence. Well, I'll start with the first-person narrator and the material he drew on, and then the novel draws on, and then its bearing on circumstances outside, if any. Those are questions. I will also speak about the matter of race or racial expression, which I think is important, even though it is not obviously to the fore in the narrative. Well, the first person narrator then, who is unnamed, this unnaming makes him less involved in the action than it would if people were to address him as Nick, as in The Music of Time. Powell may be adapting Proust, an early run on à la recherche, drawing on à la recherche, because Marcel, which is the name of the narrator, is almost never used in the text. It happens a couple of times. He's always tu or vous, depending on the interlocutor and depending on the degree of formality, etc. Then there is Hemingway. Powell was very taken with Hemingway's novel The Sun Also Rises, which he read in 1928, according to his own diaries. And he refers to this novel by name in Waring. It's often said that Hemingway inspires Powell with his laconic dialogue, instances of which occur obviously in Afternoon Men. In The Sun Also Rises, the narrator Jake Barnes refers to the English upper-class habit of speaking laconically and inflecting a wealth of meaning in a few words. The English, he says, talked with inflected phrases, one phrase to mean everything. The example he has in mind is Lady Brett. Might it be that Hemingway, while influencing Powell with his own stylistic habit, reminded him of what was lurking all along in his own countryman's diction? Well, that's a thought that one might want to pursue. But we're not talking about Afternoon Men, we're talking about Waring. Powell's narrator doesn't have the forcefulness and confidence of Hemingway's. The classic distinction, as everybody knows, between third and first person is omniscience in the third person and reduced perspective in the first. The first person narrator cannot possibly know what has happened in circumstances where he wasn't present. However, this doesn't matter to the typical Hemingway hero or narrator. As far as he's concerned, he knows all he needs to know. He knows the difference between a good man and a fool or a fraud. That's as much as he wants. As for mystery, well, there isn't any. For Powell, mystery is everything, and it deepens in complexity in the later novels of Dance. Part of the mystery here concerns the narrator himself. Often we do not know what he thinks, and this occurs at strategic moments when discretion takes the better part of self-exposure, and he might prefer, shall we say, that we did not know. On the one hand, then, first-person narrator can't be expected to know everything, can't be held to account for what he doesn't know. On the other hand, he may know things or hold feelings that he chooses not to divulge. How then does he represent himself? Well, he's got to be of reasonable, unchallenging temper so that people get on with him and they confide in him, which is what happens. Roberta Payne, the novel's heartbreaker, well, he's known her for quite a while, but there seems not to be any history between them. He's the only man not to get involved with her. This is a bit like Pamela Flitton later on, except that Roberta is a much nicer adventuress than Pamela Flitton, Widmerpool, who gives Jenkins the time of day just long enough for him to advance the plot with a piece of information. When Powell decides to give the narrator of Waring a bit of color, it can produce a problem for the plot. An example is the Territorial's dance, to which Tiger Hudson invites him, along with the Pimleys, the family which he has conveniently known from an earlier period. There's a lot of convenience in the narration. Winifred makes it clear to Beryl that she's no intention of being a partner at the dance of that friend of Tiger's, as the narrator is referred to. The narrator overhears this in a rather funny but quite disturbing scene, which I will come back to. But at the dance, he does all right for himself by getting together with a girl who reminds him of Picasso's Femme à la chemise. And if we could have that slide, Keith, that would, thank you. I thought you need a bit of color in this talk. This is the only painting I've got. But there we are, the Femme à la chemise by Picasso. And the partner, who is never named, is, it looks like her. It's possible, because there are so many personal references in Waring, that she recalls a woman whom Powell was involved with earlier. After all, this is post-marriage, this novel, but it does look back to a premarital time. But because the narrator here has no private life to speak of, any relationship with this girl has no bearing on the plot. And so she has to be discarded. So maybe we can get rid of her now. And it's a bit ungentlemanly to leave her off. But she is extraneous to the plot. I don't think we need that yet. Sorry, thank you. So a number of things do occur in the scene, but she is sort of beguilingly tempting to think about, but the plot can't do anything with her. So I think there's just a bit of apprentice work going on here, that Powell is finding his way into making use of the first person narrative. It's a thought. Well, what has gone into this novel in terms of material? We are at the end of the 30s, after all, and this is an ominous time in terms of the political and world stage. Let's just run over a few unpleasant thoughts. 1938, the year in which he completes the book, I think it's about then, and then it is published in 39. That's the year of Munich. It's the Nazi accession of the Sudetenland. The Anschluss, by which Germany annexes Austria. This happened in March 38. November is the month of Kristallnacht, and of the signing of the Kindertransport treaty by the British government, or agreement by the British government, which allowed Jewish children to be sent from Germany to this country. Does any of this make an appearance? Well, maybe some of the incidents are a bit late for the period of composition. But the Anschluss could have got in. The novel doesn't make any foray into Germany. Agents and Patients had got that, does have that sort of late Weimar visit, or visit to late Weimar, Germany. Instead, it goes in an opposite direction, the south of France. I mean, that's its foreign place. Toulon, where incidentally Powell had spent some time with friends such as Frederick Ashton and the painter Edward Burrough. At an earlier period, I said that there's a lot of personal reference in this book, and that's an example. So it draws on such relationships for passages in the book. His time with Duckworths, of course, the Judkins brothers, Bernard and Hugh, stand in for figures in Duckworths. Interestingly, Duckworth, of course, did not publish Waring. It's the only one they didn't publish. Not because they didn't like it, but I think Poe was asking for too much money. This is all documented, so I won't go into it, but it is a kind of drawing upon his own experiences, shall we say, rather directly. Thomas Balston, figure at Duckworth's, is, by Powell's own admission, the model for Hugh Judkins. Judkins, an interesting figure, a crazy figure, I mean, literally, in that he goes insane in a kind of religious sort of mania as he recoils from an affair, kind of an affair, with Roberta. Roberta is also, since we're talking about personal references, identified, I think, by as Inez Holden, based on Inez, whose story is, of course, The Society has just published rather interesting book. Now, looking across, what I did is I looked across at Powell's own journal, his memoirs. So if you read Messengers of Day, for example, well, I personally, I get the impression that there's a hint of Graham Greene as film critic, issuing reviews like Jeremiah's in Hugh Judkins. This comes up in Powell's reminiscences of the magazine Night and Day, sort of short-lived magazine, and it was short-lived mainly because of the lawsuit brought against it as a result of Graham Greene's treatment of the child star, Shirley Temple. So Greene himself, as it were, laid down the law almost well, certainly in very moralistic terms. And Hugh Judkins, as he suffers from the encounter with Roberta, falls prey to Savonarola-like curses of the filth that authors are pouring out in the name of literature. Now, an extremely funny consequence of this is the letter that Bernard Judkins, the elder brother and partner, receives from one of the regular authors who's just been subjected to one of Hugh's tirades. And this is in slide 2. I've got the quote. If you can put that up, Keith. Dear Mr. Judkins, I cannot see what my having been divorced 3 times has to do with my books. But as I've had several better offers from other publishers, I should be glad to concur in the suggested dissolution of my contract with yourselves. Yours sincerely. And then you have this curious ligature of O.E. Gulliver Lawson. I was struck by that ligature diphthong. And it had me puzzled a bit, of course. It took me a while to realize that it's an old-fashioned sort of Old English version of the letter E. You have variants like AE, as in Ethelred. So the name is Ethel. It's a variant of Ethel, but it's contracted to this, what looks like OE. It's a little interesting touch, and it's typical of various things he does. It's a slightly teasing half revelation of the name. And I like to think that it stands for the tactic of concealment and disclosure that runs through the mystery of the novel, all in all, just in that typographical effect. There is another one, Miss McKechnie, whom he encounters at the seance, the first seance. The name is spelled M' Kechnie. There's not a C, but it's a curious little suppression of a letter. And is it a quirk, or is he trying to, in a personal code sort of way, indicate something about suppressions or concealments? And of course it might, if I can push this a bit further, it might indeed involve the narrator himself. I'm thinking of the scene where Mrs. Pimley apologizes to the narrator in her house for not at first having noticed his presence there among the shadows. So she apologizes. Is this a narratological joke that Poe is making about the insubstantiality of his narrator? These thoughts, these are impressions that the book makes. Another identifiable figure is Basil Hambro, who is the model for Eustace Bromwich. Hambro, unlike Tom Bolston, recognized himself in the character that Poe had created of him, and Poe acknowledged as much. So it's not quite like the Dance and Music of Time, where I think various people are drawn in and Poe's a bit evasive about who might or might not be a model. It's fairly straightforward here. He just pulls in somebody who he thinks is right for the part. Well, Arthur Schlesinger, the famous distinguished American political advisor to the Kennedys, wrote as follows about Poe. This is not a slide, so I'll just quote. He says, the great historical happenings of the time, depression, Nazism, communism, are persistent offstage presences without distorting the fabric of the narrative. This is all in relation to later works like Casanova's Chinese Restaurant and The Kindly Ones. I mean, novels published 2 decades or more afterwards. Are these happenings, these great historical happenings, caught in what's become of Waring? Poe's reference to the territorials, in which Tiger Hudson is a captain, is a personal one. as he himself had served in them. This was not, as might appear to have been, a preparation for a probable or impending war, because he engaged in this in the 1920s, the late 1920s, 10 years earlier. He also confesses, this is all in Messengers of Day, that he kept it from his friends because they wouldn't have understood. But he keeps his motivation from the reader. Doesn't tell us. It's another maneuver of withholding information, in this case, Powell in Messengers of Day, withholding it about himself. Complete names are withheld, as in the example I've given. As for Toulon, that resort that Powell visited in the late 20s, a carefree place, halcyon days, you might say, before 1934, which he describes as the year which the world was heading for trouble in. That's in, again, Messengers of Day. That's all 10 years earlier. He's setting the action well before the 1930s. Is what's become of Waring a novel in flight from the 1930s. It's interesting to read Powell's own reflections in a later volume of memoirs, Faces in My Time, and we could have that slide up if we may. Thank you, Keith. I put everything in italics is me. I'm just highlighting. So this is Powell in Faces in My Time, thinking about the book. Rereading What's Become of Waring, I am struck even more than in Agents and Patients by a sense of nervous tension that seems to underlie a superficially light-hearted tone of voice. The working out of its situations seems at times even over-meticulous. After all, the book was not a detective story. Using that epithet, over-meticulous, with its pedantically correct implication of fear. This brooding anxiety is hard to pinpoint, to some extent expressed perhaps by an almost railway timetable approach to chronology. But the racking international atmosphere of the epoch seems to me pervasive, even if never explicitly mentioned. Well, I think that is a fascinating quote. We can try to test the truth of what he says. I personally don't straight off catch that racking atmosphere to which he refers. However, there is something going on slightly beneath the surface and occasionally breaking through, which might endorse Powell's own assessment of his novel. And I want to turn now to the question of race, which occurs at several points in the narrative, always briefly, but with an unsettling effect. There are 3, perhaps 4 races involved. The Jews, obviously enough, the Japanese, and the Blacks and Indians, the latter 2 sometimes merging together in a speaker's consciousness. All these races are involved in the history of the decade of the 30s. The first 2 in an obvious, prominent way. And here are the instances that come up in the novel as I've found them. Firstly, the Jews. The narrator goes to a party thrown by a family called Manas, and he's speaking to Eustace Bromwich. The Manasses gave a party the other day. Fun, says Bromwich. Not bad, I saw Roberta there. I suppose she was the only girl in the world, and you were the only goy. Absolutely the only one, he replies. Bromwich is rather bluff and coarse-grained. The narrator's response parries Bromwich's and gives nothing away as to his own feelings. Bromwich is not above saying to the to the narrator when they leave the wedding chapel at the beginning of the novel that he's not sure he isn't actually the father of the bride. Maybe off color. Bromwich is a character who speaks rather crudely, coarsely. When he mentions the fate of Alec Pimley, he says, when the yacht goes down, he says, they only managed to save the nigger. He's working now at a bar in Toulon. I often go there. Secondly, General Pimley. Pimley and the narrator's stamp collection. This is an odd feature in the book. It seems to be one of the flimsier threads on which Powell hangs the story. That is the stamp collection, which the narrator, I think rather improbably, possesses. The general, who is an avid stamp collector, is interested in it. I say improbably because the narrator never shows any interest in the stamps himself. The possession of the album seems to be a way of getting him together for a private conversation with the general, and here is one of them. The narrator says, shall I bring the album along for you to look through? That would be perfectly splendid. I'll bring it on the night of the territorial dance. I'll look through it. Then we can meet again and Jew each other down. One question is how far the narrator might feel about a statement such as Jewing each other down. Clearly, in the context of his discussion, he's not in a position to pull the general up on his choice of terms or language. This is another instance of how first-person attitudes may be opaque or non-committal, leaving the reader guessing. At the same time, he may be insinuating that such attitudes are less and less acceptable. In Afternoon Men, the description of the Jewish character Ferelst seems rather relaxed and unconcerned in its anti-Semitism, whether that is conscious or not on the part of the author. And here is the quote about Ferelst. And remember, this is third person. He was dark and had bags under his eyes and rather thick nose. But the general effect was not bad, and he hardly looked like a Jew at all. By 1938, when he was writing Waring, Powell's antennae for anti-Semitism would have been made keener by external events, surely, and also by his friendship with Gerald Reitlinger, the Jewish artist whom he speaks of in Messengers of Day, although he had met Reitlinger at an earlier period. Now the Japanese. The Japanese had invaded China in the Second Sino. I mean, I hardly need refer you to these events. They're so well known. But anyway, the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. And of course, they had committed the most horrifying atrocities. So it's known notoriously as the rape of Nanking. The single reference to the Japanese comes in a short sentence describing Hugh Judkins's breathing in the presence of Roberta Payne, who is clearly beginning to overwhelm him. Hugh gave several little intakes of breath like a Jap. The word Jap is now unthinkable and registers like an obscenity. This is the single racial expression that comes directly from our narrator. Does he feel, therefore, justified in uttering it? How strong does it resonate with him? Is Powell putting it here in order to draw on the reader's awareness of Nanking? Think of W.H. Auden's sonnet 1938 also, from the sequence In Time of War. And maps can really point to places where life is evil now. Nanking, Dachau. Dachau was established as early as 1933. Lighter example, Ogden Nash, the favorite poet of mine, American humorist, versifier. He added his effectively ironic humorous touch also in 1938. If we could have that slide, please. How courteous is the Japanese. He always says, "Excuse it, please." He climbs into his neighbor's garden and smiles and says, "I beg your pardon." He bows and grins a friendly grin and calls his hungry family in. He grins and bows a friendly bow. "So sorry, this my garden now." So that again is 1938. But the racial instance that really stands out in the novel is one which takes place in the action of the plot itself and delivers a moment of drama. It is probably the most emotional scene in the entire low-key narration, compared to which the unmasking of Alec Pimley as Waring is a relatively tame event. And that is the discovery by Beryl of the identity of her sister Winifred's lover, whom she sort of knows about but hasn't encountered. The two sisters are quarreling in the drawing room of the Pimleys' house prior to going to the territorials ball that I mentioned earlier, where our narrator meets the Picasso. The narrator turns up as a guest, and the scene begins by being one of the funniest in the book, until Beryl suddenly discovers Winifred's lover's racial identity. The narrator has just escaped into the room from the hallway where he had inadvertently witnessed via the hall mirror a vision of their mother in her underclothes in an adjoining room. So he's afraid that Mrs. Pimley is about to turn and see him looking at her. So he fears, as if he's going to be, fears detection as a voyeur. But he had hovered in the hallway because he'd already heard Winifred's unpleasant comments about himself. So he's really sort of stuck in. He's forced to go into the room properly. But they carry on talking to each other in this animated way. And we have I'd like to see the conversation on the slide. So if you put that up, please. What is his name? Why should I tell you? Don't then. I will. It's loud. There's a bit of intervening commentary. What a funny name. Is it Scottish or Cornish or something? What is his Christian name? I usually call him Ram. There was silence. Beryl started. I wondered if the suspicion that had occurred to me had struck her too. It had. I could almost see it creeping like poison through her whole body. Winifred, she said, he's not black. And those are the novel's italics, they're not mine. One might say that this is sort of funny. People's prejudices are often fair game for humor. But when the overall situation, that is the external situation regarding racial attitudes, is anything but relaxed, then this must have an effect on the way we laugh. At least that's what I feel. And it's a moment to which the novel has been building for some time, ever since when in an earlier chapter, one evening, the narrator has caught sight of what he imagines to be a vaguely oriental presence in flannel trousers and a dark visage in the Pimleys' garden when he's visiting the house. He asks Winifred, whom he comes across just a few seconds later. I just came through your back gate. I thought I saw a man as black as night. Nonsense, she said. It was the gardener. I expect he'd been cleaning out the flue in the stokehole. Later on, of course, the Pimleys managed to break off Winifred's engagement, or at least they think they have. Winifred proves to be one of those Pole women of indomitable spirit. The general, who else, informs the narrator. Has it been broken off? It had to be. As a matter of fact, I believe he was married already. Really? Twice. Married twice. General Pimley nodded. 2 wives, he said. All this is in confidence, of course, but it's caused me a lot of worry. This is characteristic of Pole's humor. One civilization's legitimate cultural practice represented as criminality by another. In this case, bigamy, indeed double bigamy. No mention of race. Pole speaks of a brooding anxiety that is hard to pinpoint when he talks about the novel later. The larger implications of racism may be part of what the novel conveys, if not explicitly. In Waring, the novelist, or is that only the narrator, shies away from the larger events and developments, even as they are staring him in the face. And part of that shying away seems to find expression in the particular use of the first person narration. As much as limiting the angle of vision of the narrator, which is certainly deployed to effect, the technique here leaves the speaker free not to come forth in his own person. Possibly Pole wasn't altogether sure of his own attitudes and didn't want to declare anything that might not pass muster on later inspection. One can't leave this novel, as I'm about to do, without remarking on the extraordinary last page, which for the first time introduces the topic of power. And that's the last slide, if you can put that up. How was Hugh getting on at his old profession? It was power Hugh wanted too. Everybody wanted power. Bernard wanted power. Lipfield, that's a solicitor I didn't mention, wanted power. Roberta wanted power. T.T. Waring wanted power. Did Eustace want power? It's an interesting question. Was money power? Well, one can think of those questions coming into play much later in Pole's writing life. And this goes on and on, this quote, that's only part of it. The word power is repeated almost obsessively, in fact, no fewer than 13 times. Comes almost a litany. Each of the characters is seen in one final review in terms of his or her quest for power. It all seems a bit late for the plot or the story, and the narrator gives up and falls asleep gratefully. The novel has finally announced what might have been its main theme all along. Power had certainly begun to exercise itself in a large way on the world stage by the time the novel came to be written. And well beyond the comings and goings of this small set of relatively undistinguished characters. There are, of course, hints, as I have tried to argue, but it wasn't until he undertook a dance to the music of time that Pole was able to integrate the lives of individual characters with the great historical happenings. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Very interesting. It was, yes, very interesting. Let's have some questions, comments for John. Anybody? Somebody's going to raise their hand. No, nobody. Good grief! You've dumbfounded everybody, John.
Oh dear, people like to say something.
I must admit, the mention of Toulon always reminds me of the wonderful paragraph. I can't remember whether it's in Waring or where it is that, you know, Powell talks about the soldiers at the station, you know, in their finery and their KP and so on, and you know,
it's in Waring, Keith.
It is in Waring, is it?
Yeah.
I couldn't find it quickly. I couldn't remember, and I couldn't find it quickly. Sorry, yeah, Paul.
It's the scene where he describes absolutely brilliantly the scene at the railway station as if it was the setting for a musical comedy on the stage.
Yeah, that's right.
And the little sergeant struts up and down as if he's about to sing the first song. Yeah. John, your comments on the sort of racist potentially aspects with the narrator used rather than the third person. I mean, what is your own view here? I mean, are you suggesting detecting a strain of racism in Powell which he was either unconscious of or uncomfortable with, or alternatively, is he just reflecting the attitudes of the time through the sorts of things that the characters would have said? I'm interested in your sort of your view on that.
Yeah, well, it's a very hard one to. It's a good question. It's very hard to answer. So I mean, as a personal solution to it is to lay it out a bit as with possibilities without being sure. But one thing that did strike me is that the bit I quoted from Afternoon Men, where he talks about the Jewish appearance of Verelst, that seems to me to be very characteristic of the shall we say, the regular anti-Semitism of the time, of the late 20s. I mean, this is all before the Nazis arrived. I mean, but by the time he's writing 1938, he would have been shaken out of that. And one of the reasons I think to go into first person is to let others express it while not expressing himself. Now, one can say that is because he disagrees with them, or it might be, as you say, he's worried about his own feelings, and so this is a tactical way of shall we say, not exactly hiding from them, but not disclosing it, not confronting it in himself. And I have to say, I simply don't know what the answer is. It's very interesting. I think with novel writing, especially and this is a subtle novel. I agree that it's not a great novel, and given what he achieved later, that puts it in perspective. But there are subtleties, and I think he's feeling his way around very gingerly around a difficult situation. I am interested in the fact that in one form or another, racial commentary comes up several times, not very obtrusively, but I think it is there.
I mean, just to say, I think there's a reflection of the times, of course, because even to the late 30s, people from the sort of upper middle class there would be casual references, which we would now regard as anti-Semitic. But I think going through Powell's life, he seems to be remarkably free, actually, of many of the prejudices. And I remember him, for example, when he was in Hollywood, attending a performance of Macbeth, performed entirely by a black theatre company, saying it was one of the best and most thrilling experiences he'd ever had in the theatre. So anyway, interesting point. I'll reflect on that further. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Paul. Russell.
Thank you. It's probably an aside. I haven't been able to check whilst John's been talking. The name of the publishers in the Private Eye cartoon on the books page, is that also Judkins and Judkins? Or is my memory playing tricks? I haven't been able to find a copy of Private Eye with the cartoon in. It seems to have not been in the current issue. And I wonder whether that, I don't know who the cartoonist is and whether that was sort of a tribute to Powell. And if anyone even knows.
Somebody else might know the answer to this. I mean, I do look at Private Eye quite often, but I can't remember. So I'd have to pass on that one. Has anybody got a copy to hand that they could? Usually they put, don't they, on Sue and Grabbit, the solicitors.
Yeah.
They usually pun on names, don't they? I mean, Judkins and Judkins is there is a joke in the book when Bromwich says to him, "Who do you prefer, Judkins or Judkins?" And he answers, our narrator answers, Judkins emphatically. So that's a little part of their banter. There's always a big kind of persiflage that keeps the thing floating along rather nicely.
Michael, you had your hand up.
Thanks for recognizing me. I just want to mention that there's another slightly disturbing, or maybe not slightly disturbing, mention of race in dance, in the buyer's market, in the party that Mrs. Andreatis throws. There's an African American there who's referred in terms that I think we would now consider inappropriate. I don't know how that fits in with what we've heard about in the current talk, but it strikes me as similar to the mentions that you've inventoried.
Yes, I know the scene you're talking about, and yes, it does come up. Whether he's sort of again just unconsciously lapsing, possibility, or whether he's framing it for the time and giving us the consciousness of the time, because this is a 1920s scene, isn't it? The night of the three parties. It's set in the 20s, I believe. Isn't that's the period we're in? I think.
Exactly as you say, it's impossible to tell.
Yeah, so
yeah, and remember, and it's a point I've made a number of times before, that you're relatively early in the series there, yeah. and Powell is laying down a certain number of hooks that he could pick up later. I mean, the classic one that he talks about is Commandant Leroy, but again, this could be another one, and he could have thought, oh well, I'll have that sort of character, and I might need to use him, sometime during the war or whatever, and then not done so.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
there are those possibilities as well.
Yeah.
Robin, you're on mute.
On mute. The publishers in Private Eye usually Snipcock and Tweed, don't they?
That's right. Yeah.
Judkin as well. But my other point is about negotiating with the Colonel General and during each other down. And yeah. I mean, I can remember the 1950s when that was an expression in general use, and I mean, it was in such general use that it didn't really occur to me without thinking that it referred to Jews. Strangely enough, I mean, I think we can be oversensitive in ignoring usage that was 100 years ago.
Yes. Well, no, I think it's a fair point. I suppose it is the fact that we are in the 30s in the novel with the kind of background which is never really mentioned. I mean, as I said, that he doesn't go to Germany as he had in Agents and Patients. He goes to Toulon into Rothers, and it's a balmy time, and it's a memory of an earlier time in his life. But the sense of what is happening. So yes, again, you're right. These, as was pointed out also about a buyer's market, after this wave of horror, if you like, of the building up to the Holocaust and past, it's extraordinary how much unconscious anti-Semitism still stayed in the language. It's pretty unthinkable now, but it's quite curious. And I think you're right, Robin, that even after the war, it would still just persist.
Yes, and I mean, in the context of Nanjing, it's surprising that the word Jap is used, because there was absolute revulsion and fury for what was going on there.
Yes.
And calling them Japs was the least of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think. I mean, my feeling is that very often we make too much of these things. That, you know, Powell would have been, you know, writing and using expressions that were common parlance at the time. I won't say without thought, but, you know, without a great deal of you know, intent, you know, racist intention or whatever. I mean, you know, why does he use that phrase? It's like the question of, you know, why does the painter paint a lily in the bottom corner of his picture? You know, and all the art historians wander around saying, oh, it's symbolic of this and that and something else. And you think, no, he painted a lily there probably either because his patron asked him to, because his patron liked lilies, or just because he fancied putting something there because he didn't want a bit more, you know, background to paint. You know, he felt like it, and you know, I think we have to be careful and you know, with artists and with writers, that, you know, sometimes the things they do are done for, you know, just because they feel like it. You know, for not, you know, distinctive, you know, deliberate reasons.
No, I agree with that. And in fact, he does, Powell does say somewhere to somebody, occasionally just to let the scene go a bit. You don't have to plot everything absolutely meticulously. You can have phrases that can float around and they're not doing anything. That's all right. And I agree that that is certainly an approach. And since he says it himself, it's clear enough that it's an approach. But I do find that this novel is very, very careful in its phrasing, in its artistry, that he really is like a poet. He's conscious almost of every word he uses. And that is why I started to pick up the racial thread. And I feel, well, yeah, this is more than just a bit of, shall we say, the idiom of the time floating about in the novel without any direction. And I could have traced other movements which were not loaded in this racial way, but that is the thing that sort of caught me, especially since, as I say, the reason why is I gave it in the talk, and that is the encounter between Winifred and Beryl when she discovers that Ram Lal is Indian, and she says, "You don't mean to say he's black?" And as the novel puts it, it ran like poison through her body. Now, you have to decide whether you just find this rather funny, somebody's suburban prejudice, as Ezra Pound tried to defend himself later on to Allen Ginsberg. I suffered from that suburban prejudice. Or whether you think this is going a bit further and asking more questions. And I find that at the moment in the narrative where it comes, it's quite an interesting, high moment in the plot, that it makes me feel he's going a bit further with it.
And of course, Powell uses that again with Widmer-Paul in Dance, you know, about governing black men.
Yes, yes.
He brings it back again. Yeah,
it's a very good example. Thank you.
Yeah. Michael.
Well, I'll just add that in parallel with what you said, Keith, that we may overemphasize an author's choice and attribute it to conscious choice. There's the unconscious side of that. That is the lily. Why did a lily appear in that artist's mind first? There may be something to that. There may be a significance to that of which he was not aware.
Yep. Yep. True. True. Okay. Anybody else? Sorry, Noreen had her hand up.
John, I've become fascinated recently with what happens when one rereads a book, and I suspect you've probably read this book a number of times. Do you find it becomes a different book on different readings at all?
Oh yes, it does. You sort of pick things out that you hadn't noticed before, and I think that's the case. Of course, now I was rereading it because I committed myself to giving the talk, so I reading it from, as I say, with a different intentions in mind. But yes, it is extraordinary how the thing changes the whole perspective in any rereading the author, which is why we do it. It always refreshes itself. You're going over very familiar ground, but there's something new about it all the time.
Yes, I think one also rereads partly, well, I already know this author, and I know this book, and all right, I know everything in it, but still I want to revisit it. It is revisiting an old acquaintance, but yes, I'm struck by how much you can get quite different things from multiple readings of a particular title.
And from different media too.
Yes.
Because I know when I listen to the audible audio books of Simon Vance's narration of Dance, I got a lot more from it than just reading it. No, I got a lot more of the nuance and the humour coming through. I think that's it. Let's wrap up. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much again to John, and hope to see you again in a month's time. Thanks, everybody. Bye.